All right, guys. Well, welcome to the last TBL day for the semester. This one is on the brain. So this is largely anatomy of the brain, really just looking at the overall regions of the brain and just knowing their basic functions. This is obviously could be much more complex than it is when we talk about the brain. Definitely the most complex organ in the body, and we have a least understanding of it out of all other organs as well. But we're just taking the day to look at it and just get to know the basic structures, the regions, and then know what they do. So let's get going. So we'll start just by looking at the overall divisions of the brain. When we look at this, we have these main regions: the brain stem, which includes those three regions there, the cerebellum, it's a posterior part, Diencephalon, and the cerebrum. Those are the main divisions. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So here's just an overview of the brain. If we look at each of these, we see the brain stem. There we go. So it's kind of the most inferior part of the brain, right before we get to the spinal cord, made up of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Okay, and then we go back to this posterior, inferior portion called the cerebellum, mainly for balance. We'll talk about that in a sec. We have the two portions of the diencephalon, which are the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Hypo because it's below the thalamus. Okay, and then the big cerebrum, the big part up on top. And we'll look at all these regions and a little bit about what each of them does. So the medulla oblongata is part of the brainstem. We'll start with the brainstem first. The medulla will go first. Controls many of our essential reflexes for life. Okay, so it has a cardiac center, which is responsible for controlling heart rate, a respiratory center, responsible for controlling the rate and the depth of our breathing, has a vasomotor center, which helps us maintain blood pressure by vasoconstriction or dilation, so changing blood vessel size. Also important for swallowing, vomiting, coughing. So all these essential reflexes that we couldn't live without are controlled here in the medulla. Secondly, we have cranial nerves that originate out of each region. Okay, there's 5 that come out of the medulla. We'll look at these. Well, we already looked at these, I guess, on Monday, but we see the 5 that come out of there. So it's cranial nerve 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So the last 5 come out of the medulla. And then next we'll go to the pons. As part of the brainstem, this really serves as a bridge for descending and ascending tracts. Okay, there's also some essential reflexes controlled here. Very important for sleep. Pons, sleep, remember that. And it interacts with the medulla to help with respiration. So very important for our breathing. Okay. And then we got 3 cranial nerves that originate in the pons. So it's 5, 6, and 7. Okay. All right, now let's move on to the midbrain. The midbrain, still part of the brainstem here, contains what's known as the corpora quadrigemina. So quad, that's 4, right? So there's 4 little parts to it. Okay, so we can see that here. We have the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. Okay, so we're going to see this in the sheep brain in lab. We actually have to open this part up, move the cerebellum down, move the cerebrum up, and then inside there, this is what we see when we get inside there. Okay, and that the quad part, the 4, it's like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 little regions, yeah, and so right up here is a pineal gland, which is something else we'll talk more about next semester. It's part of the endocrine system. But for the midbrain itself, we just have the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. We'll talk about what those do here right now. So the superior colliculi, think of those as visual reflexes. So it coordinates eye and head movement. Okay, so think about something coming at your face rapidly, like you're watching a baseball game, and all of a sudden a ball starts coming at you, and you just catch it out of the corner of your eye. The reason that your head moves so rapidly without you thinking about it is because of reflexes controlled in the superior colliculi. Inferior colliculi are important for auditory reflexes. So think about it. You're walking down the street, and all of a sudden you hear a loud honking sound behind you. Okay, somebody honks their horn. You jump, right? There's a big startle as part of that. And that's because of that auditory reflex there. It's to protect you. You don't really have much control over it. It's just going to happen, right? That's that startle reflex driven by auditory sensory input, so hearing. And then in the midbrain, there's also a region called the substantia nigra. It's a dark region. That's why it's called nigra. That means black. Highly pigmented, necessary for dopamine formation. Okay, and the disease that we find being implicated here is Parkinson's. Parkinson's results from degeneration of the substantia nigra. Definitely an important thing to remember. Okay, so I'll let you fill this in on the recap. What are the functions of each of those three regions we just talked about? Okay, let's move on to the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, again, is that posterior inferior portion of the brain. And it receives sensory input from three main areas, from the inner ear, talking about balance and spatial awareness, from your eyes, and from the position of your muscles and joints. Okay, so it receives all that sensory input, and then it helps give the right motor outputs to keep your balance. Okay, so it puts all this information together to help you balance. Okay, this is strongly affected by alcohol, right? That's why balance gets thrown off when somebody's had too much to drink. Okay, so important for balance, so it coordinates all that sensory information and coordinates it with motor information. That's how we maintain our posture. That's how we coordinate complex movements like walking, learn movements like throwing, catching, jumping, those things. Also important for coordinating our eye movements to counteract our head movement. So when we're focused, so you can do this right now while you're watching this, focus on the screen, but then move your head to the right, move your head to the left. You'll notice that you're still focused on the screen, right? That's because your eyes move to the left when your head moves to the right. That's because your cerebellum senses that movement in your head and causes your eyes to move, so your eyes will stay focused on the screen. Also important for coordinating all the muscles having to do with speech. Okay, so the next part, diencephalon. Diencephalon is made up of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. We'll talk about the thalamus first. Thalamus, the main thing you need to know about it is it integrates sensory information. So all sensory information comes through here except for olfaction, which is smell. Okay, so then it sends all that sensory information on up to the cerebrum. So it coordinates all sensory information. Okay, the hypothalamus is right below that. Right, that was the thalamus. This is the hypothalamus. Okay, its main job is to control the autonomic nervous system. So it controls that sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Okay, so that's important for digestion, for heart rate. Okay, controls the pituitary gland, which is an endocrine gland that controls a lot. We'll talk about that next semester. It's important for emotions, important for motivation drives. We're thinking of hunger, thirst, libido, which is sex drive. So the hypothalamus is a very important portion of the brain. It does a lot for this small little squished part of the brain. You wouldn't think it does much. Okay, so I'll let you go ahead and recap the cerebellum, the hypothalamus, and the thalamus. All right, let's move on to that big portion of the brain, which is the cerebrum. Okay, so a couple general features of it. We have what's called the gyrus, and the gyrus is just an elevated ridge, so it's all these little ridges. Right? Then we have a sulcus, which is the down part, the part between those ridges where it's down. Looks more like a little furrow, right? And then the fissure is this deep sulcus. Okay, we have one big one in the middle. All right, other general features of the cerebrum, there's white matter and gray matter. The gray matter is made up of cell bodies. It's not white, it's gray because it's non-myelinated. This is mostly the dendrites and the cell bodies. Okay, and so those are on the outside there, right? Those are all cell bodies, all those somas of neurons, and then they send their axons in. Right, all those axons are going into the other parts so they can connect with other neurons. And those are myelinated, right? Those are myelinated with lipids, and lipids are typically white. That's why white matter is axons. Okay, so when we look at the cerebrum, it is split into right and left. So the right side is typically going to be going to the left side of the body, and the left side is typically going to be going to the right side of the body. That's because there's always a crossover point, and that crossover point typically happens in the spinal cord, not up in the brain, actually. We'll see that more when we look at the spinal cord. So these are all the lobes. We'll look at these each individually. So let's start with the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe is on the, not all the way in the front, where the frontal lobe is, it's back here on the sides, okay? And this is mainly responsible for senses. So we find the primary sensory cortex here, important for touch, temperature, and pain. Okay, when we think about the primary sensory cortex, this would be just one side of it. So this would be the medial side of it. This would be the lateral side of it. Think about this as like the right side. It's one slice of the primary sensory cortex. So this would be that middle part of the brain where that big fissure is. And then this works our way out all the way down, like towards the ear, right? This is the ear right here, okay? So when we think of that, this little diagram, which is called this guy's called the sensory homunculus. I'll just write that in here, homunculus. The homunculus is just a way to envision which part of the brain is responsible for the sensory information for which part of the body, all right? So all the way in the medial side, here's the genitals. Here's the foot, right? Then we work our way down to the eye, way over here, right? Intra-abdominal, way down here by the ear. Okay, and you can see that the bigger the region is, the more sensory information you have. So look at that, the lower lip is huge, almost as much sensory information going to the lower lip as you have going to the whole arm here, right? So that means the lips are much more sensitive than the others, and that's how this homunculus converts into a person, right? They make this little person. The larger the regions are, then the more sensory information, the more sensitive to touch, right? So the fingertips are very sensitive to touch, and then the lips are very sensitive to touch, right? Then other regions like your forearm is not very sensitive at all, okay? So that's just the way to look at that. All right, so when we look at the occipital lobe of the cerebrum, which is the very posterior part of it back here, we have two main areas: the primary visual cortex, which directly receives input from the eyes, and then the visual association area, which does all the processing of that, right? So the input comes in here, primary visual cortex, and then it goes to the visual association area, which processes the vision information, okay? And just think about it, 1/3 of this whole cerebrum is dedicated to visual processing. So it's a huge part of our brain, just dedicated to our eyes. Okay. Next one, temporal lobe. It's over by our temples. If you think of your temples, which are kind of just anterior to your ears and just a little bit superior, that's our temporal lobe. Okay, but it's bigger than that. It spans this whole region. Okay, and this is important for all auditory information. So think about temporal lobe, think about hearing. Okay. All right, frontal lobe is next. So it's the large part of the brain, largest lobe, the frontal lobe. In the frontal lobe, we have a couple different regions. We have the primary motor cortex, which is the most posterior part. And we have what's known as the premotor cortex in front of that. Okay, so primary motor cortex is the first part of the frontal lobe, because once you get back to there, that's back to parietal, back there. So primary motor cortex, we have a similar diagram, just like we did on sensory, where it shows where each part of the primary motor cortex innervates each part of the body. Okay, so same idea. Again, the size of the region shows the degree of control, how fine of control do we have in each region. Again, our fingertips are highly controlled, lots of precise movement there. And then again, the right side of the brain will control the left side of the body, and the opposite. Okay, so then we move forward a little bit more anteriorly, the premotor cortex. This is important for complex and learned movements. Helps us plan out our movements and sends the signals from the premotor cortex to the primary motor cortex. Then we move forward anterior one more, right? Because we had primary here, premotor here, and then we have prefrontal here. So the prefrontal cortex is very important for lots of things. It integrates all sensory inputs. This is where all of our higher order thinking occurs: our intellect, our will, our personality, our working memory. One disease that's implicated here is ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This is implicated as at least part of the problem is not enough inhibition in this prefrontal cortex area by a specific neurotransmitter that we talked about last week in class called norepinephrine. Okay, so then moving other parts of the cerebrum. We have some other areas called basal nuclei. These are important for regulation of muscle tone and movement, things we don't have to think about. These interact with the motor cortex and the cerebellum. We also have tracts all throughout the cerebrum. Tracts are just areas that connect one area to another. So it links a single hemisphere of the cerebrum. That would be association tracts. Those would be all ones that are within one hemisphere. But then we also have projection tracts, which are tracts that descend or ascend. So those go down into the spinal cord. And then we have commissural tracts. These are tracts that connect the two cerebral hemispheres, right? So go from right to left, or left to right. Okay, and then we also have what's known as a corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is the largest commissural tract, right? This is actually the connection between the right and the left hemisphere. Okay, we have 4 cranial nerves that originate here. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then we have another very important region known as the limbic region, and this is just a kind of an interior part of the brain. And there's a lot of information here. You don't need to know all of these different names and structures. The important part about knowing about the limbic system is that it's just different portions of the brain all connected together via these tracts, so they can all work together. Okay, and so the limbic system. Here's the important things you need to know. The functions of it are important for emotional responses, very important for memory, gets lots of sensory input, and then connects those with other parts of the brain. A few important parts to remember: hippocampus. This is very important for memory formation. This is implicated in Alzheimer's disease. Memory recall. The amygdala is very important for the fear response. Early brain development is really starting here. This is kind of like our primary early brain. One of the parts of the brain that can be traced through many species of animals. And what we see with PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, is we have overactivity of the amygdala. We have overactivity of the amygdala, then we have an excessive fear response. Too much responsiveness of that activity or of that region makes you too sensitive to things that produce fear. And then lastly, the cingulated gyrus. This is connecting our smell with our emotions, right? Smell is directly connected to memories and emotions, and we may smell something and it automatically triggers us to be sad or be happy, and that might be connected from an old memory of having that smell and also having other emotions going on at the same time. The cingulated gyrus is what connects that for us. And that's it, guys. I know it's a quick run through, so make sure you run through those, learn those regions, learn their basic functions, be able to point them out on the brain itself, and you should be good to go. All right. See you soon.